We back, and we're taking a look today at Communist Manifesto. Um, so yesterday we took a look at a couple pages, which have since been titled "Estranged Labor" or "Alienated Labor." These are from the 1844 manuscripts written by Marx himself. We're jumping ahead 4 years to the Communist Manifesto of 1848, which Marx wrote with Friedrich Engels. And I mean, I hope you'll find it considerably easier going. This was written, I mean, it was written to be read by members of the working class in 1848 in Germany and elsewhere in Europe. And so the prose is a little more straightforward. It doesn't have a kind of Hegelian, uh, uh, these kind of endless dialectic excursions. Um, So it should be easier reading. And it's also a bit more, I guess, directly political. This is probably the Marx that you recognize, to whatever extent you're familiar with um, Marx's thought. And so we will just jump right in. A quick note about 1848. So if you know anything about European history, you know that 1848 there were series, we call them the revolutions of 1848 or the 1848 revolutions. Revolutions sort of broke out across Europe. And what was different about these revolutions than previous ones in, the 1780s or 1815 or 1830 or any other time is that these clearly had a an economic dimension. Now, of course, most historians today, many of whom have been trained through methods that owe their methodological insights to certain Marxist traditions or traditions that Marx took part in. Many historians today will say that all revolutions are essentially economic. But strictly speaking, this mostly isn't true. But the revolutions of 1848, when we say that they were economic, they're the first set of revolutions that have as their sort of motive force a a new class, and it's this new class that Marx calls the proletariat. Not that there hadn't been workers before, not that there hadn't been working class people before, not that there hadn't been haves and have-nots before, but the proletariat has this sort of specific quality to it. Namely, it tends to be urban, whereas the poor, the workers, tended to be in all previous periods of human history, they tended to be farmers, which is to say they tend to be involved in agriculture in one form or another, which does not take place in cities for the most part. Right. So these tended to be urban groups, and they tended to be workers under the material structure that we think of now as industrialism. Right. So these are concentrated, closely associated factory workers, meaning these are workers in industrialized and urbanized environments. Um, that is pretty new. You don't see that in 1789, for example, despite the fact that the revolution was carried on most fervently in the major cities and especially in Paris. Uh, but what's happening in 1848 is a new kind of revolution. And what Marx and Engels thought they were doing here is, in a way, kind of midwifing what they thought was going to be a new age. And so these opening lines, pretty well known. A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. All the powers of old Europe have entered into a holy alliance to exorcise this specter. Pope and Tsar, Metternich and Guizot, French radicals, and German police spies. And so they're suggesting that like they're on the precipice. It's happening now. The fetters of industrial capitalism have worn thin, and the working classes are about to burst through. And when the working classes burst through, um, there will be a revolution. There will be a potentially quite violent uprising, and the means of production will be seized. So there's a lot to explain in the manifesto. And in explaining it, I'm not going to be drawing so much from the document as I'm going to be drawing from Marx's thought more generally. And we can begin with the theory of class conflict. So if we look here under number one, um, the history. Oh, this isn't. One second, guys. Okay, we'll try this again. Highlighter. So here he writes, the history of all hitherto existing societies, the history of class struggles, freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guild master and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight, a fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large or in the common ruin of contending classes. So so it is straightforwardly the case to say that Marx interprets history through the lens of class struggle. Now, for Marx, each stage in history is characterized by a different form of class struggle. The form that the class struggle takes will be generated, it will be determined by the material stage in history. So this is somewhat jargon-laden explanation, and so I'll try to lay it out a bit more clearly. The basic idea is this. For Marx, as we discussed yesterday, material precedes consciousness, which means that Marx is a thoroughgoing materialist. For him, we are organisms that exist in a particular material environment. And as organisms, we take on certain characteristics in response to that environment. So for Marx, if you want to understand history, the first thing to understand is not the ideas, and it's not the great men of history. If you want to understand history, and for those of you who have any experience taking history classes or sociology classes at the university level, you can see this basic understanding of history. If you compare a history textbook from today versus 150 years ago, or a history syllabus from today versus 150 years ago, you'll find a lot less emphasis on so-called great men or great moments in history. There's a lot less focus on war and treaties and this kind of thing. You'll find a lot less focus on what we now call intellectual history, and you'll find a lot more focus on material history, meaning like what were working conditions like? What was the average day of a peasant like? What was the condition of women under certain circumstances? Um, what was what were the economic conditions or the economic incentives faced by the minor gentry? And the idea is that if you want to know what history is about, don't focus on the big things and don't focus on the ideas, because the big things and the ideas, these are just the icing, right? This is just what's on top of the cake. These are just the deck chairs. And what's actually happening is underneath. What's actually happening, what's actually driving history is the slow march, slow progression of the material circumstances of human society, which is to say, changes in what Marx calls the means of production. So, what are the means of production? The means of production refer to the means, the tools, the methods we have at our disposal for producing things. Production refers to the process whereby we take raw nature and turn it into a finished good, a product. Right? So at any time in human history, human beings will have available to them certain means of production. And we can just look at the various stages in human history. So hunter-gatherers, right? What does the phrase hunter-gatherer mean? It means that human beings lived according to these techniques called hunting and gathering. We are faced with certain basic needs. We have to eat, we need shelter, we need clothing, this kind of thing. And at any given time, we have certain means available to us to get those things. So hunting and gathering means that in order to get food, in order to convert nature into food, a product that I can use, the process that I use is the process of hunting. Hunting refers to not just a spear, right? It's not just technology, though it is definitely technology. Hunting is also it's a method. It's a practical activity. There's know-how involved with hunting. And so even in hunting, we can adopt different methods, we can adopt different strategies, and these all contribute to the means of production. Likewise with agriculture, right? So agriculture is a different form of production. With agriculture, we don't hunt and gather food, right? Our techniques aren't hunting and gathering. With agriculture, we cultivate the earth. But of course, within agriculture, there's all sorts of technologies that assist us, right? So the invention of metal, for example, and the invention of increasingly sturdy plows. These are important steps in the development of agriculture, but also certain techniques. So crop rotation, the scientific knowledge that tells us, what kind of soil is good for which kind of crops, genetically modified plants. All of this stuff contributes to the practice of agriculture. All of this stuff contributes to the means of production, right? So the means of production are those techniques, those technologies we have available to us that allow us to convert raw nature into finished stuff, stuff that we need, stuff that we want. Right. So that's the process of production, and the means of production are those tools that we have available to us to do that. For Marx, if you want to understand history, don't look at ideas, don't look at philosophy, don't look at great men, don't look at great events. Look at production. The production, Marx says, the stage of development and the means of production at any given moment in history, that production will determine the class structure. It will determine the class structure. So a radical change in the means of production. So for example, the industrial age. So the industrial age refers to a number of changes, but all of these changes contributed to a kind of fundamental shift in the means of production away from largely man-powered agriculture and towards kind of consumer market-oriented industrial form of production. We can see that's somewhat abstract. We can just say, listen, like most of the workers in 1600 were engaged in agricultural work. Most of the workers in 1900 are engaged in industrial work. So that suggests a major change in the means of production. That change, the change in the means of production will, Marx thinks, will bring about an equally dramatic change in the class structure. So whereas in the Middle Ages, you had a class structure that was efficient with respect to the means of production available. So it was basically man and animal powered agriculture. So basically what you were looking for would be a broad distribution of the population throughout all arable land. But of course, you'd need to protect this. So you would need a kind of central military force. So something like feudal organization, where you had relatively small but consistent populations spread out over arable land, and these populations were maintained and protected by one central military force, namely the feudal lord. That's efficient. But of course, with respect to industrial production, that's not efficient. In industrial production, you're looking at large amounts of workers, and they need to be concentrated in industrial centers. They need to be concentrated in cities. Why? Because large-scale industrial production requires access to large stores of capital, right? So you need banking infrastructure. It also corresponds with access to markets, right? So in other words, industrial production means producing tons and tons of stuff, and you can only produce tons and tons of stuff if you can sell tons and tons of stuff. So you need to be in cities with large populations to sell stuff to, and you need to have access to global markets to exchange your stuff. So feudalism works with a certain stage in agricultural production. It does not work with respect to industrial capitalism. It's a form of social organization, social and political organization that cannot exist in conjunction with industrial capitalism. What exists under industrial capitalism, Marx thinks, is something like the liberal nation state. So, in other words, highly centralized, highly professionalized, highly commerce-oriented structure that serves to protect property rights first and foremost. So, for Marx, when you see great social and political revolutions, what we're seeing is these changes in the means of production, these changes in what Marxist analysis calls the base. These changes have grown so profound that they're beginning to sort of, they've been bottled up for so long, and now they're beginning to erupt into the social and ideological spaces. And that's what he thinks is happening in 1848, right? So the previous forms of social and political organization, specifically the liberal capitalist state, it has been in place during a time when it was appropriate to the base, the change in I'm sorry, the current stage in the means of production. But there's been these energies that have been sort of bottling up, and these energies are concentrated in the thing that capitalism produces other than stuff. And the thing that it produces other than stuff is the proletariat, is the working class. So for Marx, history is a series of what you might call punctuated equilibria. It's a series of historical stages which refer primarily to the base, which is to say, it refers primarily to that stage in the development of the means of production. That stage in the means of production, it will carry on as long as it can carry on. And then eventually, the kind of dynamic process, the kind of give and take between the material base and the social and political superstructure that sits on top of it, it will grow untenable and you'll have a revolution. And a new class will come in, and that new class will be the class that typifies this particular stage. So in feudalism, that class was nobility. And the counterposition to the nobility was the serfs. Under capitalism, what capitalism produces is, or what capitalism requires, the capitalism is organized according to the capitalists. In this particular work, he's referring to them as the bourgeoisie. So who are the bourgeoisie? The bourgeoisie are those who own, who have private property claims to the means of production. Who are the proletariat? The proletariat are those who operate the means of production, those who do not own any capital, which is to say the only productive capital they own is their own labor power. The only thing they have to sell is their own labor power. So the old order has been replaced, Marx thinks, over the course of the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries by this new order. This new order is called capitalism. It is characterized by this essential class distinction: the capitalists, which is to say the owners of the means of production, the bourgeoisie on the one hand, and the proletariat, the workers, the laborers under the means of production on the other. And the forces of capitalism have advanced to the point that it can no longer exist on its own. This is the other thing about Marx's theory of history, is that it's essentially dialectical. And I don't want to go too far into this. It's very difficult to explain in like over Zoom or whatever. It's a essentially Hegelian notion that suggests that each stage in history contains within it the seeds of its own undoing. So for Marx, there is something in capitalism that will eventually undermine capitalism. And we're going to read about that in just a second. I mean, the straightforward answer to it is that the thing that capitalism produces, the thing that it requires, even more so than natural resources, the thing that it requires is an increasingly large and increasingly urbanized and an increasingly impoverished proletariat. As he puts it about midway through the manifesto, the thing that capitalism ultimately produces, the bourgeoisie ultimately produces, is its own gravediggers. It needs more workers, it needs them at lower wages, and it needs them physically present to work. And it needs more of them constantly. And eventually, what it does is it creates a class of people that is so large, so immiserated, so concentrated in the city centers and in the industrial centers that they eventually begin to recognize themselves as a class. And at that moment, when they recognize themselves as the proletariat, as the next major class to emerge into world history, that's the moment at which they'll rise up and seize the means of production. Capitalism needs an increasingly large and increasingly poor proletariat, but eventually the proletariat grows so large that it undoes capitalism itself. Okay, it's a lot. I realize it's a lot. So as we kind of go through, and really for the manifesto, the most interesting part or the most relevant part for our purposes are these first two sections. In fact, I'm not going to say much really past page 491. One thing to note after we talk about history, one thing to note is really, particularly in these early pages, page like 474 through 477 or 479, we notice that Marx actually has lots of what you'd think would be like really nice things to say about the bourgeoisie and about capitalism more generally. Um, uh, So here, the bourgeoisie historically has played the most revolutionary part, right? The bourgeoisie is the institution responsible for sweeping away all the feudal and patriarchal relations. Um, uh, it's constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production, immensely facilitated means of communication. Um, it's done a lot of things. Let's see, where's the really, there's a few bangers in here. Um, yeah, so if we look here on 477, it's just an interesting paragraph. The bourgeoisie, during its rule of scarce 100 years, has created more massive and more colossal productive forces than of all preceding generations together. Subjection of nature's forces to man, machinery, application of chemistry to industry and agriculture, steam navigation, railways, electric telegraphs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What earlier century had even a presentiment that such productive forces slumbered in the lap of social labor? So, I mean, Marx has lots of really bad things to say about the bourgeoisie. After all, he thinks they're responsible for the immiseration of a large percentage of the population. They are oppressors, first and foremost, he thinks. But, and this is an important thing, for Marx, they are necessary, right? They are necessary. Each stage in the development of the means of production produces this social structure. And each social structure is responsible for sort of carrying out with a kind of discipline the internal dynamic that it's responsible for. So the bourgeoisie is the ascendant class in this new stage, and they have done their job remarkably well. So on the one hand, they've immiserated a large amount of people, but on the other hand, they've increased productive capacities like no one had previously thought imaginable. They'd increased the size of world markets like no one thought imaginable. They have lifted certain standards of living in ways that previous people had thought unimaginable. Like there's no denying the incredible productive capacity of the bourgeoisie. I realize there's a lot of sort of 20th century and 21st century, a lot of it at universities, a lot of sort of Marx inspired thought that claims that, a lot of European nations didn't make their wealth so much as they stole their wealth. Right? A lot of Marxist thinking gets sort of sucked into schools of thought that we now think of anti-colonialist thought, and a lot of this stuff is very lazy. But Marx himself was under no illusions whatsoever about what the bourgeoisie was capable of. They had completely and totally revolutionized not just the political world of Europe, but the economic world of Europe. They had remade the world in their own image, and that image was a productive one, right? So Marx is not, foolish enough to think that production, economic production, wealth, GDP per capita, all this stuff. Marx was not foolish enough to think that nothing had changed in these respects. The bourgeoisie were responsible for producing the largest amount of wealth, again, an amount of wealth previously unimaginable in human history. There's no doubting that. Marx does not doubt that for a second. But the cost of that was immense. The cost of the development of this technology, of these means of production, of these communication networks, of these trade networks, the cost of producing all this kind of stuff was the creation of the proletariat. So by creation of the proletariat, Marx means that, like, listen, all the previous forms of production, the mom and pop shops, the domestic textile production, the country farmers, the gentleman farmers, all this stuff gets sucked up into the capitalist machine. These are relatively inefficient forms of productivity, and capitalism abhors nothing so much as inefficiency in the same way that nature abhors a vacuum. And so ultimately for Marx, what the capitalist class, what the bourgeoisie can't help but do is create a larger and more miserable working class. And so we see by the end of the work on 483, or by the end of the sections we're going to look at, the following lines: hitherto every form of society has been based, as we've already seen, on the antagonism of oppressing and oppressed classes, but in order to oppress a class, certain conditions must be assured to it under which it can at least continue its slavish existence. The serf in the period of serfdom raised himself. Actually, let's skip this. Just next paragraph. Uh, no, that's fine. The serf in the period of serfdom raised himself to membership in the commune, just as the petty bourgeois, under the yoke of feudal absolutism, managed to develop into a bourgeois. The modern laborer, on the contrary, instead of rising with the progress of industry, sinks deeper and deeper below the conditions of existence of his own class. He becomes a pauper, and pauperism develops more rapidly than population and wealth. And here it becomes evident that the bourgeoisie is unfit any longer to be ruling class in society and to impose its conditions of existence upon society as an overriding law. It is unfit to rule because it is incompetent to assure an existence to its slave within his slavery, because it cannot help letting him sink into such a state that it has to feed him instead of being fed by him. Society can no longer live under this bourgeoisie. In other words, its existence is no longer compatible with society. The essential condition for the existence, for the sway of the bourgeois class, is the formation and augmentation of capital. The condition for capital is wage labor. Wage labor rests exclusively on competition between the laborers. The advance of industry, whose involuntary promoter is the bourgeoisie, replaces the isolation of the laborers due to competition by the revolutionary combination due to association. The development of modern industry, therefore, and this is not just the modern industry, this is the bourgeoisie in general, cuts from under its feet the very foundation on which the bourgeoisie produces and appropriates products. What the bourgeoisie therefore produces above all is its own gravediggers. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable. So that's the story Marx is telling here, and there's a lot packed into that. And I want to finish by, I guess, sort of defining some terms, because this stuff remains extremely politically controversial today, theoretically quite potent. We very much live in a world in which the terminology that Marx uses, including terms like capitalist, is still very much with us. And so I just want to very briefly define some terms that are kind of maybe help you make some sense of this. There are at least 3 isms, maybe 4, that we should sort out. So the first one, just very briefly, is Marxism. So Marxism is any species of thought, any ideology which takes as its founding source Marx. So we throw the word Marxist around a lot today. I think we do it mostly quite carelessly. Marx didn't have anything to say, for example, about postmodernism or anything like that. I mean, he's a relatively confined. He's a 19th century socialist thinker. There were a lot of other thinkers like him. He didn't really become a kind of a big deal, actually, until the Russian revolutions at the turn of the 20th century. It wasn't just the sheer potency of Marx's thought that made him famous. It was mostly the Russian Revolution. So Marxism is a very limited term, and we can mostly discard it. There are 3 important terms, though, that I think we should define, and those are capitalism, socialism, and communism. So capitalism is, in Marx's theory anyway, it is the stage at which he's writing. And what defines capitalism is the fact that what defines capitalism, according to Marx, as a system of political economy is the fact that the means of production are privately held. Capitalism is a political economical system according to which the means of production are privately held. Now, that's actually a pretty good definition. That describes our situation today, right? So the means of production refers to things like car factories, oil refineries, AI companies, software companies, computer companies. I mean, all this stuff refers to the means of production. Still, privately, farms, seed companies, all this kind of stuff. We do a lot of producing, and in a place like America, that production is undertaken in most cases. In fact, mostly in nearly all cases, it's undertaken by privately held individuals or corporations. Right? Whether they're beholden to shareholders or to individual owners, we can say that the means of production are privately held in America. And they're privately held in most Western nations. There are a few notable exceptions. Right? So some states have sovereign wealth funds based on oil production. Some of them have what we sometimes refer to as socialized medicine, which can be socialist medicine in some cases, and which can be sort of redistributionist medicine in other cases. But for the most part, most Western nations remain capitalist, which is to say that the means of production are privately held. Socialism refers to a political economical system under which the means of production are publicly held. A system of political economical, it's a system of political economy according to which the means of production are publicly held.
There are very few examples of successful socialist states. There are occasional acts of socialization. So, for example, in Venezuela, recently there was the so-called nationalization of the oil industry. And when we say that it was nationalized, what we mean is that the means of production that correspond with the production of oil or with petroleum were publicly held. They were taken out of private hands, usually seized, and they were placed under public production. Now, they were run by the state. Some people call this corporatism, but the general principle is the same. The idea is that these oil companies will no longer be run according to the will and according to the benefit of private parties. Rather, and whether those private parties are individuals or shareholders, rather, these oil companies will be operated according to the public interest. So they'll be publicly held. That's socialism. Socialism refers to a system of political economy according to which the means of production are publicly held. There's a third thing, which is communism. Communism is pretty wild. Um, Communism refers to a system of political economy according to which private property will be abolished. So it's difficult to point to any large scale communist states, mostly because it's very difficult to do communism at scale. It's very, very difficult to order production without the feedback mechanisms that are enabled by private property, in particular markets and the price mechanism. So we do have some small scale examples of communism. So, for example, like upstate New York and certain parts of California, we have a lot of so-called communes where people live and they work and they do so without reference to, like, they don't use currency, they don't have barter economies. They just live essentially, according to this, like Marx sometimes puts this as like from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. Um, the kibbutz system in Israel is a little bit like this. I mean, there are some examples of sort of small scale communist living, some of which is inspired by Marx, but most of which is not, most of which has a religious basis. But it turns out communism is really hard to do at scale. The 20th century is full of examples of large nation states who attempted to adopt communist economies, and it ended pretty badly. I should probably point out that there's a fourth thing here that sometimes gets confused for socialism and communism, and that thing is what you might just call the welfare state. So in America, we have a large welfare state. And again, I'm not saying, like, I realize the welfare state is itself a kind of politically controversial idea. But if you take something like Social Security, so Social Security, what it does is it taxes working people and it redistributes that money to non-working people. I mean, that's the basic principle behind it. I realize that there's a lot of rhetoric about, well, actually, you pay into your own account, whatever, but whatever. For the most part, it redistributes wealth from the productive elements of society to the unproductive wealth of society. That's just what it does. And we do a lot of that. A lot of that goes upward, right? There's various forms of corporate welfare. There's various forms of top-down welfare, Medicare, Medicaid, all this kind of stuff. A lot of it goes to the elderly. A lot of it goes to the poor, but it mostly goes to what we think of as the unproductive populations in society. Now, a lot of people say that this is socialism, but according to the definitions we just looked at, this is not socialism. This is a different thing. It's not socialism because it doesn't actually dictate the means of production, doesn't dictate the terms of production, right? It isn't socialism because it doesn't actually place the control of the means of production under any central authority or under the authority of the public in general. It does redistribute the wealth produced by private holders of the means of production, but it doesn't actually own the means of production. Now, again, you can object to welfarist redistributive policies, and you can object to socialism. But it is important that we acknowledge and that we note that there are important conceptual and practical differences between the two things. Welfarism is not socialism. And in fact, most of the successful welfare states are, strictly speaking, capitalist. Many of them are extremely capitalist in the sense that they have extremely market-oriented economies. After all, the more wealth you have, the more wealth you have to redistribute. Okay, so I'll leave it there today. There's a lot of terms to define. There's a ton of stuff coming out of Marx. And again, I realize that the politics of this can sometimes be can kind of cloud the issue. Try to avoid the politics as much as you can. Um, the idea here is to kind of understand and reproduce these ideas as faithfully as possible. And whether or not we accept them or reject them or something else, uh, first we have to understand them. All right, I'll leave off there for today. Next up, we have Burke, and then we're getting pretty close to the end. All right, we'll see you guys.